Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Maurice Samuels, the director of the Yale Program for the Study of Antisemitism, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you today to this hybrid lecture, both in person and on Zoom. It's our first attempt to do a hybrid format here. So the way it's going to work is that I will introduce Professor Feinberg. He's going to speak for about 40 minutes. And then we'll take 20 minutes of questions from the audience, both in person and on Zoom. So those of you on Zoom, we ask you to submit your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. The chat function is disabled. And then we will ask in person, Professor Feinberg, your questions that you submit in the Q&A function. And you can submit those questions at any time during the lecture. You don't have to wait until the end. So I will now introduce Professor Feinberg. Ayal Feinberg is one of the leading researchers doing quantitative analysis of anti-Semitism, an extremely valuable contribution to the field. He is Associate Professor of Political Science and Anti-Semitism Studies and is the director of the Center for Holocaust Studies and Human Rights at Gratz College, overseeing the largest Holocaust and genocide graduate program in the world. His research has been widely featured in leading international journals and media outlets, and his scholarship is frequently utilized by practitioners and policymakers concerned with the insecurity of marginalized groups and the perseverance of the Jewish community. In addition to all of this, and in addition to his academic position, he's also a quantitative research fellow at the Anti-Defamation League Center for Anti-Semitism Research, and he recently completed a 3-year term as the junior faculty chair at the Academic Engagement Network. His anti-Semitic bias incident analysis was inducted into the congressional record during the 2019 House Judiciary Committee's hearing on hate crime and the rise of white nationalism. His talk today is entitled Clarifying Antisemitism Through Experiments, Exploring Blame, Responsibility, and Hate Crime. So please join me in welcoming back to Yale, Ayal Feinberg.
Thank you for that very, very kind introduction, Professor Samuels. Very excited to be back at Yale to be presenting some of the experimental research that I'm doing along with my colleague, Dr. Jacob Scott Lewis at Washington State University. A lot of this research is pretty new for us, and we're really excited to begin to share this research with the public. So we really welcome all of your questions, your comments, and ways that we can improve upon and build on this research. So the title, as Dr. Samuel said, is Clarifying Antisemitism Through Experiments, Exploring Blame, Responsibility, and Hate Crime. Sorry, everyone, just getting the clicker ready. Okay, I think it's critical to talk about why I'm engaged in this process. Although I'm proud that my research is as objective as I'm able to design it, I am motivated by an overarching normative concern about violent antisemitism. And I think that these 3 images share a lot of important elements that we need to be thinking about when we're constructing antisemitism research today. I think most people are familiar with this image on the right of the Tree of Life Synagogue Memorial outside of the Tree of Life after the most lethal anti-Semitic attack on American Jews in our country's history. On the left is the AMIA attack in Buenos Aires, an attack that most American Jews are far less familiar with, but resulted in 87 fatalities. Many consider this attack to be the most lethal anti-Semitic attack post-Holocaust. And what's really critical here as we struggle with understanding the role of anti-Israel sentiment and anti-Zionism in explaining anti-Semitism is an image from the riots that happened in Sarcelles, France in 2014, where Jewish businesses and Jewish individuals are indiscriminately targeted because of the behavior of Israel. Clicker struggles continue. Sorry, everyone. Give me 1 second. Okay, success. All right. There is concern surrounding rising anti-Semitism here in the United States. There is a general feeling that Jews are less safe. How do we know this? What are the empirics that we're utilizing to base this information on? Well, the AJC has done a survey of the American Jewish population where they ask several questions that help us to determine the security of Jewish Americans. One of the questions that they frequently ask in the survey: do you think that anti-Semitism is a problem in the United States? From the most recent iteration of the survey, 89% of Americans say that anti-Semitism is a problem in the United States. In fact, this number hovers between about 80 and 95% in any given year. It doesn't tell us a great deal at an individual level about Jewish insecurity, but what I think helps us to articulate the current situation quite greatly is that 82% of American Jews believe that anti-Semitism has increased. There is a feeling that there is increasing anti-Semitism. These numbers are higher than many previous years, and that 41% of American Jews report feeling less secure than a year ago. Only 4% feel more secure. Again, these numbers seem to show that there is a new feeling, a new increased feeling of insecurity amongst American Jews. The other thing that we often do is look to the surveys where we ask about anti-Semitic trope alignment. So the ADL has offered up many surveys since 1964 using the same question battery aimed at measuring the number of anti-Semitic trope alignment that exists amongst the American population. What do we see? A big difference from 2019 to 2022. This shift, this gap, 20% of Americans constitute about 54 million Americans that now fall into the category of those that align with at least 6 of the 11 anti-Semitic tropes that the ADL measures. Okay, so a little bit about what I'm going to be doing today in this presentation. I want to do a little bit of housekeeping first. I never know exactly who my audience is, so I think it's important to do a brief overview of anti-Semitism and share a little bit about anti-Semitism empirics. I'm going to talk to you and provide you an overview of some of the experimental literature that already examines anti-Semitism. And then I'm going to share 2 of my own experiments that I've done, again, with Jacob Scott Lewis at Washington State, exploring blame attribution and responsibility to speak out, as well as the effects of hate crime exposure on foreign policy preferences. And then I'm going to tease everybody with a little bit of future survey. So let's start with defining anti-Semitism. A tremendous amount of time, resources, and concern surround how do we define anti-Semitism. It's one of these enduring questions. On the left is the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, seen by many as a gold standard, a way that institutions can adopt a definition that best protects Jews, in part because of how IRA provides specific examples of when anti-Zionism constitutes anti-Semitism. On the right is the ADL's definition, right? The ADL, one of the leading organizations concerned with Jewish safety and insecurity. Happy to go over some of the differences that we see in these definitions in the Q&A, but I wanted to make sure that we were provided a definition of anti-Semitism. Every presentation that I give on anti-Semitism, I include this quote from historian Paul, because I think it's critical that when we evaluate anti-Semitism, we understand that no perpetrator ideology owns anti-Semitism. As we see anti-Semitism being weaponized on the left and the right, it's important to remember that anti-Semitism manifests in a multitude of ways. Jews are always showing off. They are hermetic and secretive. They will not assimilate. They assimilate only too well. They are too religious. They are too materialistic and a threat to religion. They are uncultured. They have too much culture. They avoid manual work. they work too hard. They are miserly, they are ostentatious spenders. They are inveterate capitalists, they're born communists, and so on. In all its myriad manifestations, the language of anti-Semitism through the ages is a dictionary of non sequiturs and antonyms, a thesaurus of illogic and inconsistency. What are these enduring questions that I mentioned? Things that we struggle with, that we don't yet have generalizable answers to, but are absolutely critical in how we seek measuring and tracking anti-Semitism. First and foremost, who is a Jew? Is being Jewish something that's scalable, or is it binary? Understanding this is absolutely critical, and there is, again, no generalizable agreement on what constitutes this. Most survey research, a lot of the work that I'm going to share with you today, that explores specifically Jewish perceptions, much of this comes from the idea of self-reporting one's Jewish identity. What is anti-Semitism? How do we define anti-Semitism? Should we even use the term anti-Semitism? AJC did some recent polling on this that said an enormous proportion of Americans, near the majority of Americans, don't know how to define anti-Semitism. They haven't really heard of it. So perhaps we should push towards using alternative terms that most Americans would be able to identify as representing Jew hate. There's a movement that suggests that we should, instead of using anti-Semitism, use the term Jew hate. Of course, I mentioned the IRA definition. We saw a lot of concern regarding this when Biden rolled out his new plan to combat anti-Semitism. What definition should we use? Because if we're not all utilizing the same definition, we're not all calling the same balls and strikes. Should we be using JDA? We have Nexus. We have several other definitions of anti-Semitism that we should consider. And then, of course, anti-Israel, anti-Zionist beliefs. When does holding specific anti-Israel sentiment, or when does manifestation of specific anti-Zionist beliefs actually constitute anti-Semitism, if ever? No generalizable agreement here. Other things that I think we should consider are measurement concerns. We do a lot of research. Most of the tracking that we see, most of what Americans are exposed to, are either tallies of hate crimes or some of the survey results that I already shared with you today. Attitudes and behavior, while we like to think that these are connected and linked, in reality, their relationship is far less clear. So we need to be exploring research that really connects specific attitudes to particular manifestations that we're most concerned. What about anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism? Philo-Semitism being those that love Jews. These two phenomena are not only linked, sometimes when you measure them, they show up in the exact same ways. Some people have gone as far to say that philo-Semitism in and of itself is a form of anti-Semitism. So it's critical, as we're trying to decipher what constitutes anti-Semitism, are we measuring anti-Semitism? Are we measuring philo-Semitism? Are these terms the same? And especially in the United States, what many have called the most philo-Semitic country in the world, this is an important thing that we have yet to truly figure out in the discipline. And then, of course, latent anti-Semitism. When we think about racism, even those that are the most virulent racists and bigots, they don't always wear that on their sleeve. It doesn't define their every action and opportunity. Often, it takes a certain stimulus to induce an element of racism and bigotry. Much of anti-Semitism is latent. So how do we measure a phenomenon that isn't necessarily empirically available for us? I also want to talk a little bit about general measures of anti-Semitism. When it comes to our choices in doing quantitative research, we can look at events. This often constitutes acts of terror, hate crime variation, bias incident variation. We can look at social media measures on tweets, YouTube, Facebook, TikToks, not just the content itself, not just content frequency, but the responsiveness of these very platforms in removing the content. How quickly they remove it. Are they removing it for certain actors only? Does it take a specific actor to report the content in order to remove it? And this has become very important, of course, with Elon Musk's takeover of the ADL, of X, Twitter X, and his concern regarding the ADL in that fashion. Policy. We can look at governmental discrimination. Here in the United States, we like to think that there is no longer governmental discrimination targeting Jews. But across Europe and in many other places, Jews are not always able to practice their religion freely. Societal discrimination and institutional discrimination are other outlets that we can use to measure anti-Semitism. There's interesting work that's now being done through network analysis, looking at organizational connections, looking at group mapping, looking at extremist networks. How are hate groups organized? How are they building content? How are they building followers? And then, of course, attitudes and beliefs, what we commonly evaluate through surveys, but also through interviews, focus groups, and experiments. We're having a few technical issues. Okay. Common descriptive approaches, right? What we most frequently see, surveys. One of the biggest challenges we have here is that anti-Semitism, as I mentioned, is an extremely challenging phenomenon to measure. In 2022, the ADL changed its battery that it hadn't changed since 1964. We added 3 questions and we changed some of the valences. What do we see? At the very top, when asking a nationally representative sample, 70% of Americans say that Jews stick together more than other Americans. Report that that's at least mostly or somewhat true. At the bottom, 16% mostly or somewhat say that Jews are not as honest as other business people. Anti-Semitism is multifactorial. There are many ways in which it can manifest. So any survey that attempts to measure it has these challenges. How do we measure all of these elements of anti-Semitism? We can look at incident reporting, and the ADL audit report is something that's very common. The FBI's hate crime report that comes out annually is another way that we can evaluate anti-Semitic incident variation and anti-Semitism in the United States. A tremendous amount of money is going to fund interventions and to generate policy that combats anti-Semitism through these primarily descriptive approaches. What I contend is that we need to go further. We need to do more rigorous quantitative analysis. We need to understand the mechanisms that explain why certain attitudes are more likely to lead to anti-Semitic behavior. Through the experimental work that I and others are pursuing, I'm hoping that that's going to be the case. So why experiments? Experiments offer us a really unique way to isolate specific factors and correlates we think explain variation in anti-Semitism. It helps us to evaluate what are the structures of anti-Semitism. In some cases, as I mentioned with latent anti-Semitism, what are the conditions that elevate anti-Semitism? What's the relationship between attitudes and policy preferences? Something I'm going to share today with our research that explores hate crime exposure. And how does an exposure to a specific narrative or event alter belief? In a traditional marketing sense, message testing. It's important to note, right, as I promote an experimental approach to understanding anti-Semitism, there are shortcomings that we are constantly considering. The pollster effect, or what many have known as the interviewer effect, the emergence of specific characteristics of the messenger or the deliverer of a certain question altering the way in which a respondent approaches it. One of the ways that you can do that is to make sure that you have multiple different characteristics of any sort of enumerator, any person that's responsible for delivering it, and to evaluate whether or not there is this messenger effect in place. A bogus pipeline. A way to avoid some of the social desirability concerns of a potential respondent let them know that, in fact, we are able to detect when they're lying. And then, of course, pure control and vignette control. This is something my colleague Jacob Scott Lewis and I are very interested in, is whether or not we should be looking simply at a pure control, those that aren't exposed to any sort of treatment, or whether we should also provide an innocuous treatment, and whether or not, or seemingly innocuous treatment, and whether or not that actually creates different findings. So I'm going to go over briefly now some of the most important pieces of experimental literature in evaluating anti-Semitism. This is largely focused on the work of Michal Bilavich at University of Warsaw, who is the leading expert when it comes to anti-Semitism experimentation. So one of the main beliefs is that it's important for us as scholars to create typologies of anti-Semitism. What are the factors that explain anti-Semitism? Bilavich et al. In 2013 focus on authoritarian personality characteristics. They focus on victimhood-based social identity. They focus on relative deprivation. And they examine whether or not this manifests in these factor loadings here of focusing on a three-factor structure of anti-Semitism: conspiratorial anti-Semitism, traditional religious and anti-Judaic beliefs, and secondary anti-Semitic beliefs, those that focus on Holocaust commemoration. They looked at a population in Poland to do this work. What they're able to find is that specific factors of anti-Semitism help to explain variation in how somebody would choose to donate resources to commemorating certain elements of history. Specifically, that anti-Semitic beliefs and holding of anti-Semitic beliefs, the possession of it, and the strength of those beliefs help to make one choose to provide those resources to a museum that's not associated with the Holocaust, but instead a broader national museum. So what this shows here, what the summary shows, is that those that hold traditional anti-Semitic beliefs, secondary anti-Semitic beliefs, and belief in Jewish conspiracy all donate less money to Jewish organizations. A lot of concern is focused on the contact hypothesis. For those that are not familiar with the contact hypothesis originating with Allport in 1954, what Stefanik et al. Do in 2022 is a meta-analysis of 8 different studies evaluating active engagement with historical ethnic diversity in Poland. The idea here was to provide a specific curriculum for students across Polish high schools and to evaluate whether or not engaging in this curriculum with Jews helps to reduce anti-Semitism. Participation in the intervention contributes to building knowledge and interest in local history, more positive attitudes towards Jewish people, and toward ethnic diversity in general. Attendees of this program developed stronger place attachment and civic engagement intentions. But their general social trust and attitudes toward other ethnic groups, the Roma people, remained largely unchanged. So this element, this program, this curriculum works in the reduction of anti-Semitism, but it is not nearly as effective in reducing broader forms of prejudice. A lot of individuals are concerned with the notion of power and anti-Semitism, but also powerlessness and anti-Semitism. What happens when people lose their agency? What happens when there's a lack of power, a lack of control, and feelings of uncertainty? So first and foremost, we know that lack of control and uncertainty in the political domain are highly interconnected. Political uncontrollability rather than political uncertainty predicts individuals' beliefs in Jewish conspiracies. So what happened in this case with this research design? One group was given a vignette that focuses on political uncontrollability, The other was given a vignette that looks at political uncertainty. And what they find is that it's the uncontrollability, not uncertainty. It's the lack of agency that helps to explain individuals' beliefs in Jewish conspiracies. Political uncontrollability, they find, predicts belief in Jewish conspiracy even after controlling for anti-Semitic discriminatory attitudes, even when you control for prior beliefs. The same study also shows that lack of control may be specific, particularly to conspiracy stereotypes of Jews, and less specific to groups not viewed as prototypical conspiring agents. It's specific to Jews, not Germans, not Russians. There's a direct relationship between feelings of lack of control and general conspiracies, but that belief is weak. And there's an increase in the endorsement of conspiracy stereotypes of Jews driving other conspiracy beliefs. Great work from Antonell et al. In 2015 and 2020, focusing on the Greek context. They're really interested in understanding this notion of competing and collective victim. Anti-Semitism stems from a sense of collective victimhood, defined as a perception that an individual's nation has been a victim of history that is rooted in the historical narratives found in education and other socialization agents. So what do? Right? They provide specific vignettes that are aimed at increasing a sense of comparative victimhood or collective victimhood. What they find is that inducing in-group favoritism leads in-group members to downplay the collective suffering of others. This manifests through antagonism with other groups, widely acclaimed as victims over the moral benefits emerging from victimhood status. So to put it simply, there is a competition over victimhood that they're identifying through this process. Now, I think this is an experiment that really is useful for understanding a lot of what's manifesting in America today as it relates to hate speech and as it relates to anti-Semitic social media content. The Sorrell et al. Piece shows that lower sensitivity to hate speech was a positive mediator of the relationship between frequent exposure to hate speech and outward prejudice. They provided desensitization training. And what they found is that after you desensitize somebody to hate speech, individuals were less sensitive to hate speech and more prejudiced towards hate speech victims than their counterparts that were in the control condition, those that did not receive that desensitization training. The effects of exposure to hate speech on prejudice were mediated by a lower sensitivity to hate speech and not by a lower sensitivity to social norms. And the last piece that I want to show you before going into my own work is the mortality salience piece and the double standards piece that was done by Florent Cohen et al. In 2009. The effect of mortality salience, and when we say mortality salience, the idea of bringing up the idea of death. The effect of mortality salience on increasing support for punishing countries that commit human rights violations was most strongly apparent in the Israel condition. So when you expose somebody to this idea of death, it manifests with specific anti-Israel sentiments and an increase in anti-Semitism. Because anti-Semitism may increase hostility to Israel, it's hard to parse things out. And this is some of what I'm trying to do now with my experimental work. So my work has long focused on what we call the homeland diaspora nexus, understanding the role of Jewish attachment and identity as it relates to Israel, but also how Israeli behavior and perceptions of Israeli behavior affect the identity and insecurity of Jews. This is really a combination of what I'd say are several disciplines: international relations, anti-Semitism, and those that focus on hate crimes, a lot in criminology and a lot in sociology. The main research question that I'm interested in answering is, what is Israel's role in explaining variation in anti-Semitic events and hate crimes? I did a piece in 2019 that really explored this in the European context. right? We've seen a lot as it relates to some descriptive statistics about spikes in anti-Semitism when Israel's engaged in a violent conflict in the Middle East. Operation Protective Edge, looking at France and UK here, we see a massive spike in the month that Israel's engaged in that operation, only to decline back to normal levels just a month or two later. When I looked at data from 2009 to 2017, evaluating any month where Israeli casualties from war exceeded 100, we see a 35% rise in anti-Semitic hate crimes that are reported across 28 European states. I also looked at this in the American context. The most philo-Semitic country in the world. What did we find? We found that Israeli military operations, the weeks in which Israeli military operations took place, was the most important substantive factor in explaining anti-Semitic incident variation here in the United States. Total incidents increased by roughly 24% in those weeks. But what's critical here is that violent incidents increased by 33%, right? There's a connection between Israeli violence and anti-Semitic violence here in the United States. And then on a college campus, I think it's important to show this research because a lot of concern about anti-Zionism takes place on college campuses. Jews, when compared to other minority groups on college campuses, are more likely to experience hate crimes. And when you look at some of the events or characteristics of a campus that might explain anti-Semitic incident variation, we see that the celebration of Israel Apartheid Week, the commemoration of Israel Apartheid Week, and the presence of an active SJP chapter, both tied, of course, to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, help to predict increased anti-Semitism. So I want to go into my own work now on blame attribution and the responsibility to speak out. The idea here is that when we see Jews being targeted for the actions of Israel, is it because perpetrators blame Jews? Is there a feeling that Jews, the diaspora, have a responsibility to speak out against the actions of Israel? What is the mechanism that explains the decision to engage in this behavior? So our research questions, are diaspora communities or those groups that are linked with international actors blamed for the actions of their homeland or an associated international actor? Are diaspora communities or groups linked with international actors, are they believed to have a responsibility to speak out against their homeland? And is this a case of these phenomena only focusing on Jews? Are diaspora Jews uniquely blamed for the actions of their homeland and the only group responsible to speak out against it? How did we do this? We designed a survey. What we did is we utilized these experimental vignettes. What we did is we used an image of an apartment building and a hospital that was damaged in a bombing, but we changed who the target and the perpetrator was. On the first image you see, on the first story you see Israel bombing Gaza. On the second you see Russia bombing Mariupol. On the third you see Saudi Arabia bombing Sana'a in Yemen. We also have another image of ISIS operating in Afghanistan. We asked our survey respondents, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much are the diaspora or the linked group to blame for actions and policies towards the target group? So how might this manifest? In a series of questions, right? We didn't just ask about Israel's actions towards the Palestinians, but in those series, how much are American Jews to blame for Israel's actions and policies towards the Palestinians? Provide us an answer on a scale of 1 to 10. Same question, but designed to also capture responsibility to speak out. What do we find? Well, when we look at attribution of blame, only Jews, only those that were exposed to the Israel treatment see an increase in blame as a treatment effect. Not American Russians that were treated with the Russian treatment, not the Saudi Arabian ISIS treatments that we provided. This does not increase American Muslims being blamed, just Jews. This is a breakdown by ideology. I think this is critical to show, in part because one of the sub-findings that I'm happy to go into in the Q&A, but what we see is that those on the far right actually see a reduction in blame towards Jews and see a significant increase in blame towards Muslims when they're exposed to our Israel vignette, our Israel treatment. We see similar phenomena when it comes to the attribution of responsibility to speak up. Again, only the Israel treatment results in a significant increase in the idea that Jews have a responsibility to speak out against that linked international act, in this case, Israel. This is, again, a breakdown of responsibility to speak out by ideology. I think it's useful. On the left, we're looking at it broken down by Jews, Muslims, and Russians. On the right, we're looking at it broken down by ideology. So to give you a brief findings summary here, blame of diasporas for associated conflicts is relatively low across the board, while applied responsibility is substantively higher. We were surprised by this. Blame and responsibility, they don't seem to operate on the same scales. Only Jews, those exposed to our Israel treatment, see a significant increase in both blame and responsibility. Those on the right, broadly speaking, blame Muslims more than any other ideology blames any other diaspora or linked group. Those on the left believe Jews are blameworthy and responsible to speak out more than Muslims or Russians. And building on recent scholarship examining anti-Semitism on the extremes, what we're really finding here is that the effects of the treatment are manifesting in the greatest substantive fashion on the ideological extremes. This treatment effect is magnified on our political polls. And I want to introduce you to just one other experiment, hate crime exposure and foreign policy preferences. We know that hate crime reporting has gone up. There's greater media exposure to hate crimes. This is an image of a CNN report examining anti-Semitic hate crimes in the United States. We know how hate crimes affect the target population. But what does it do? How does it alter policy preferences at a national level? We ask, how does exposure to anti-Semitic hate crimes alter foreign policy preferences, not amongst Jews, but looking at a nationally representative sample? Specifically, does exposure to anti-Semitic hate crime alter foreign policy preferences towards Israel? And even more specifically, does it manifest in certain elements of foreign policy? Is this something that's going to be specific to a general alliance, something that we associate perhaps with military aid, or preferential trade? We provided a series of vignettes to our respondents, one that focuses on a vandalism attack, one that focuses on a physical attack. We also vary what the motivation was. In some cases, the perpetrator is graffitiing death to Jews. In some cases, it's death to Israel. Same with the statement in the physical attack, death to Jews or death to Israel. We also change the identity of the perpetrator. All factors that we think might help to explain variation in foreign policy preferences. So how do we ask this? How do we begin to assess foreign policy? We ask, in your opinion, how important is it for the United States to maintain a strong alliance with Israel? but we also ask that same question of a battery of other countries. We ask them to indicate their level of support for U.S. military assistance. We ask them to indicate their level of support for preferential trade with Israel. And again, a series of other countries. What do we find? We find that those that are exposed to hate crime across the board find it more important to provide military assistance to Israel. They find it more important to have a general alliance with Israel. They find it more important to provide preferential trade agreements for Israel. And we're wondering why. Why is this taking place? What are we seeing? Is this manifesting because of a sense of personal threat? So we're exposing people to this treatment. We're exposing them to a story of a hate crime. Does it make them feel personally threatened to do that? We don't find considerable evidence that that's actually the case. Well, does this also manifest perhaps in feeling of increased threat towards racial communities? Is this inducing that phenomenon? Don't find considerable evidence of that either. But what we see is that exposing our respondents to hate crime, anti-Semitic hate crime, does increase a general sense of threat towards all religious communities, with the exception of the dominant religious community in this country, the Protestant community. So those that are exposed to the hate crimes, when compared to our control group, right, feel that there's considerable threat towards religious communities in the United States. So to just go over briefly, finding summary here, exposure to anti-Semitic attacks caused strong support for pro-Israel policies relative to the control group. Outgroup exposure to hate crime increases perceived support for the victim group, at least via preferences that we measured vis-a-vis associated foreign policies in their wake. And what's so critical here is a baked-in normative consequence. It suggests that those that are committing acts of hate are actually generating policy preferences and potential support for policies that presumably they oppose. Doing a lot of really interesting future survey work, again, trying to utilize this as an approach to examine anti-Semitism and the mechanisms of anti-Semitism in critical ways, focusing on elements of conspiracy, whiteness, hope and cooperation, comparative prejudice, so not just focusing on anti-Semitism specifically, utilizing specific message testing, and also focusing on the effectiveness of interventions. And I want to close with this work that was recently done in our ADL, our 2022 ADL survey. We asked respondents, do you think this individual pictured here, who may be from a Jewish singer from Israel, a singer that performs in the United States, or an Arab singer from Iraq? So again, to clarify here, some people were given this treatment. Another series of people were given this treatment. And the last series were given this treatment. Do you consider this person to be white? What we found was that those who were told that the individual pictured was Jewish, was a Jewish singer from Israel, were significantly more likely to identify the individual as white. Those that were given the singer from the USA or an Arab singer from Iraq, no significant difference between the two. White respondents who viewed the Jewish Israeli singer as white endorsed fewer tropes, fewer anti-Semitic tropes than white respondents who viewed him as non-white. And among non-white respondents, the perceived whiteness really didn't have a measurable impact on anti-Semitism. This individual is Duda Salah. He is an Iraqi Jewish singer living in Israel. So I'm going to close there, just always close with images of my cats and my daughter. Any questions or concerns, comments? Again, a lot of this is in the early stages, so we really welcome your support and your work and your feedback. Please feel free to email me at my Gratz email. Thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ayal, for that very interesting presentation. And I know some people have written in that there's an echo problem. Hopefully that's been taken care of. We apologize. We're still trying to figure out this technology.
Yeah, and apologize everybody for my clicker happiness throughout. I'm sorry.
Okay, so a bunch of questions from the audience. I have some questions too. One quick question that just came up is, could you explain the hyphen? I mean, this is, in anti-Semitism, this is something that always comes up in anti-Semitism studies. So are you a hyphenator or no? And what does that mean?
So from the very beginning, I would write to editors that I'm okay with the decision of the journal to choose how anti-Semitism should be spelled. I was never somebody that focused on this because I felt that it took away from more of the meaningful, impactful research that we could be doing, examining the manifestations of anti-Semitism. I believe there is a place for definitional concerns of anti-Semitism, and I applaud the scholars that engage in it, but it's not the area of focus for me. The origin of this is commonly expressed as related to this notion of there being no Semitic people, that being Semitic is actually a language orientation, and therefore by getting rid of the hyphen and making it anti-Semitism, right, we're making this a phenomenon that's specific to Jews. But I'll go back to the comment from the slide where I talked about this very subject, which is that many people in the United States, a huge proportion of people in the United States, don't know what anti-Semitism is. So this is part of a broader debate that we need to be having in terms of clarifying the visibility of the subject.
Okay, great. So a question about AI.
Yes.
Yeah, so can you talk a little bit about AI-generated anti-Semitism? Is this posing an even greater risk than what we were experiencing before? And maybe just tell for audience members who aren't familiar with AI what we're talking about here.
So first of all, I am no expert in AI myself. So let me make that clear. There are some individuals that are working on this research that know it much better than I do. But the idea here is that, in fact, you can take the correlates of anti-Semitic propaganda that work the best in terms of influence, in terms of recruitment, and generate truly excellent anti-Semitic propaganda. It can help you. Generative AI can help you in terms of finding the best avenue in which to advertise this or present this material. It can help you in recruiting specific individuals by testing this back and forth. You can provide generative AI a variety of different elements of propaganda, and it can refine it for you. I can tell you that this is something that's of deep concern in the intelligence community. And it's worthy of studying and evaluating further. I can tell you that definitely there are actors that are utilizing AI for the purpose of making anti-Semitic propaganda and rhetoric more impactful.
Thank you. So a few questions actually about your surveys, and are there generational differences in how people respond to the survey? How do you control for that?
Well, we always control for age, for education, anything related to SES. We control for religion. We control for any of the demographic factors, the geographic factors that are critical in designing a nationally representative sample. There are some interesting generational effects. We see that there is not always this linear effect as it relates to age. Many people assume that anti-Semitism is going to be highest among the oldest population. That is not always the case. It depends on the specific element of anti-Semitism you're trying to measure. For example, when it comes to anti-Zionism, right? Anti-Zionism, and again, not that all anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, but anti-Zionist anti-Semitism, right, is actually lowest amongst the oldest generations, and it's highest amongst the younger. I think that comes as no surprise to many people. But elements of anti-Semitism that are related to power, related to economics, right? That's oftentimes a millennial phenomenon, right? In part because of the exogenous factors that they experienced as it relates to the recession.
Okay. And so would you say that there are different anti-Semitisms in, like, we're talking about the American context right
Sure.
now. So for instance, we have what's going on, arguably on college campuses, but that seems to me anyway, very different from Orthodox Jews on the streets in Brooklyn getting attacked. So how do your surveys get at those different kinds of anti-Semitism? Because it strikes me that, it's picking up something, but it's maybe not picking up those differences.
So yeah, I think that there are different elements of why Jews might be targeted for specific behavior. First of all, when we think about the broadest structure possible, you have to be able to identify a perpetrator, right? If you're able to identify a perpetrator identify a target. A perpetrator needs to identify a target. When you identify a specific target, right? When we think about Jews, right? Not all Jews are going to be identifiable to a perpetrator. There's not an even distribution of Jewish institutions that can be targeted. So specific areas where there's a higher concentration of Jews, including American college campuses, are going to see, let's say, an increased likelihood of anti-Semitic hate crime as a consequence. That's going to be different, right, than areas that have fewer Jews. When it comes to thinking about this topic from a visibly Jewish standpoint, thinking about, let's say, Orthodox or Haredi communities, yes, we note that there's higher likelihood of hate crimes that are targeting those individuals. When asking those individuals about their experience, they're more likely to say that they experience anti-Semitic rhetoric, being the victims of an anti-Semitic incident. So again, this all plays a role in the likelihood of hate crime manifestation.
And do you see that there's more measurable anti-Semitism on college campuses with greater Jewish populations?
So we find that, yes, the larger the Jewish population, the greater the number of incidents that are being reported. We find that the proportion of Jews, so when we think about it from a percentage standpoint, that's not a great predictor of explaining anti-Semitic incidents on campus. So you need a certain critical mass of Jews to experience considerable anti-Semitism.
But you do find that on college campuses, and that's true kind of across the board, like it really correlates or is it, how have you guys, who's studying that and what have they?
There's lots of research that's really trying to examine this issue. The work that I did was a project for AN. What I did is I looked at Hillel International's report on Jewish populations across different institutions. We looked at the AMCA incident rates that have been reported, and we evaluated whether or not there was a relationship between the size of the Jewish population of that institution, as well as prestige, as well as geographic characteristics, acceptance rates. We looked at a variety of different correlates, but we found that one of the most important predictive factors of whether or not an institution would see heightened anti-Semitism was, of course, the size of the Jewish population.
Okay, here's a question that I'm not sure you'll be able to answer, but I'd love to just hear what you think, which is, if Israel weren't in the picture, would the incidence of anti-Semitism still be on the rise? Is it impossible to separate the two?
I love and hate counterfactuals. If Israel wasn't here, would incidents still be on the rise? What I'd say is that it's really important that we don't think about anti-Zionism and anti-Israel sentiment as something that exists exclusively with one ideological domain. One of the things that I often do, I didn't do it in this presentation, is I show two vehemently anti-Zionist quotes, one coming from Louis Farrakhan and the other coming from Matthew Heimbach, who's a relatively infamous neo-Nazi here in the United States. Again, the idea here is that anti-Semitism, right, didn't exist. I mean, anti-Semitism doesn't exist exclusively in specific ideological domains. It doesn't. I think anti-Zionism specifically and anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism is a convenient way to manifest certain elements of anti-Semitism in a more socially acceptable way. It's not always that case, but I think it's a useful tool for that reason. If Israel wasn't here, would we see it on the rise? I don't know, obviously, and I would refute anybody who says that they do, but anti-Semitism has existed for millennia. So I imagine it would still be here, and the most infamous incidents of anti-Semitism in this country existed prior to the creation of Israel.
And so a lot of your studies, or the ones you showed today, reflected, we're trying to control or trying to examine anti-Semitic feelings according to political positions.
Yeah.
But what about, are you studying, or is anybody studying the effect of like family background or levels of stress and anxiety in the home, or things like that, and how that contributes to anti-Semitic, so more kind of psychological profiles
Of the perpetrators?
Of perpetrators, yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think it's hard to get access to that data, right? First thing, when we think about hate crimes and reported hate crimes, we look at reports that are coming from policing agencies. The number of hate crime prosecutions in this country is remarkably low. So those that we can really definitively say are perpetrators of a hate crime, using that definition of being convicted of a hate crime, profiles on that sense are really mostly available in a comparative sense, in a qualitative sense, less so a quantitative sense. Are there specific elements of someone's upbringing that makes them more likely to potentially engage in anti-Semitic behavior? We can look to some of the work from perpetrators themselves reporting on this issue. A sense of loneliness, a needing to belong in a non-nuclear family structure. These are things that explain hate crime perpetration, potentially, but they also explain all crime perpetration. So it's really hard to disentangle this.
Yeah, and I've heard Gunther Jakelli, some of his research, which has shown that maybe, counterintuitively, levels of poverty didn't really see in studying anti-Semitism in European Muslim communities. It wasn't correlated necessarily with socioeconomic background, but much more with exposure to, extreme religious ideologies. Okay, we're basically out of time, but I wanted to end on maybe a more hopeful note by
Sure.
what research is being done on which solutions work best for, solving anti-Semitism or making it at least a little bit better?
I think there's a really big push now to try to figure out anti-Semitism interventions, ways in which we can reduce both the causes of anti-Semitism, how we can generate policy that prevents the manifestations of anti-Semitism, the behavior, and then also, right, how do we assess, right, the effectiveness of these elements, of these policies, of these interventions. A lot of this is being done through education. There's actually really amazing work that's being done by Joshua Cowell and David Brookman that I will let them speak to, because I don't believe it's yet out, but they're doing fantastic work evaluating the various ways in which one can intervene to reduce anti-Semitism from both an educational and a policy perspective. There's a question of whether contact is going to be effective, if it's a specific type of contact. Again, I showed you some of the work on that from the Polish context. I can tell you that from working with some scholars in Norway, the Pathfinders program specifically What they've done is expose individuals to Norwegian Jews, communities that normally don't have Norwegian Jews, focusing on the Norwegian elements of that Jewish individual's experience. And they see a considerable reduction in anti-Semitism, but also prejudice towards other minority groups and marginalized groups in Norway. So there are avenues that are being explored, but it's widely understood amongst the scholars studying anti-Semitism that this is the area that's received the least rigorous attention.
Okay, terrific. Well, thank you so much for your really enlightening talk, and thank you to everyone in the audience for your questions. I urge everybody, if you're not already, to please get on the YPSA YPSA mailing list. We have a lot of interesting programming this year, and look forward to seeing you all at future events. So please join me in thanking Ayal Feinberg.